There's a temple in Greece, ancient beyond measure, where women once came to whisper their secrets to a goddess who understood what it meant to be trapped by the very thing you fought for. The ruins still stand, crumbling marble columns reaching toward a sky that remembers when this place mattered, when pilgrims traveled for days just to stand before her altar and ask the question that haunted them. How do you stay when everything inside you screams to leave? They came seeking Hera, queen of heaven, goddess of marriage, protector of wives and families. But here's what the prayer books never told them, what got erased from the mythology we learned as children. Hera didn't want to be the goddess of marriage. She was forced into that role by a husband who betrayed her from the very beginning. Trapped in a divine institution she never asked for, bound by cosmic law to protect the very thing that was destroying her. And the most disturbing part? She chose it. Every single day, for eternity, she chose it. This is not a love story. This is something far more complicated. Think about that for a moment. We know Zeus as the king of gods, the wielder of lightning, the ultimate symbol of power and authority. But who made him king? Who stood beside him when he claimed the throne? Who legitimized his rule in the eyes of gods and mortals alike? Hera. She was the queen, the one who transformed a rebel with a lightning bolt into the cosmic order itself. Without her, Zeus was just another god with power. With her, he became the foundation of civilization. Marriage, in the Greek understanding, wasn't about love. It was about legitimacy, about creating bonds that couldn't be broken, about turning chaos into order through sacred vows. And Hera was the embodiment of that principle. She was the force that said some bonds are eternal, some promises can't be unmade, some things matter more than your personal happiness. She was the goddess who turned suffering into duty, who weaponized her own pain and made it divine. But before she was the bitter wife, before she became the jealous queen who punished Zeus's lovers with curses and transformations, before any of that mythology that's made her infamous, Hera was something else entirely. She was free. Born to the titans Rhea and Kronos, swallowed by her father moments after her birth, trapped in darkness alongside her siblings Hestia, Demeter, Hades, and Poseidon, she spent her entire existence, her formative years if gods can be said to have such things, in the belly of a titan who was so terrified of prophecy that he consumed his own children. Imagine that childhood. Imagine growing up in literal darkness, knowing you exist only because your father was too afraid to let you live. Imagine being freed, finally, violently, vomited up into a world at war, where your rescuer and youngest brother Zeus was already planning a revolution that would reshape reality itself. Hera emerged into chaos. She emerged into war, and she fell in love with the only person who seemed to understand what it meant to survive the unsurvivable. The courtship of Zeus and Hera is one of those stories that gets romanticized in some versions and completely ignored in others, but the truth, as always, lives somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. Zeus pursued her relentlessly, not as the king of gods because he wasn't king yet, not with power and authority, but with cunning and persistence. He transformed himself into a wounded bird, appeared to her drenched and pathetic in a storm, and Hera, moved by compassion, held the creature close to warm it. The moment she let her guard down, Zeus revealed himself and took what he wanted. Some versions call it seduction, some call it trickery, some don't bother with euphemisms at all. What matters is this: their relationship began with deception. It began with Zeus understanding that Hera couldn't be won through honest means, that he had to manipulate her compassion, exploit her kindness, use her own nature against her. And Hera, faced with the reality of what had happened, made a choice that would define her for eternity. She married him. Now, here's where you have to understand the context, the world they were living in, the rules that governed gods and mortals alike. In ancient Greece, a woman's honor, her entire social existence, depended on sexual purity. Once that was lost, regardless of the circumstances, her options narrowed to almost nothing. Marriage was the only path that restored legitimacy, that transformed shame into respectability. Hera could have refused Zeus. She could have remained unmarried, become one of the virgin goddesses like Artemis or Athena, carved out a domain that had nothing to do with relationships or family. But she didn't. She chose marriage. She transformed her violation into a partnership, to take the man who had tricked her and bind him to her through vows that even gods couldn't break. It was an act of reclamation, of taking power in the only way available to her. It was also, and this is the part that makes the story truly tragic, a trap. Because the moment she became the goddess of marriage, the moment she made that institution sacred and unbreakable, she locked herself into a relationship with a man who would betray her constantly, endlessly, for all of eternity. The wedding was legendary. All the gods attended. Gifts poured in from every corner of the cosmos. Gaia, the earth itself, gave Hera a tree that bore golden apples, and Hera planted it in a garden at the edge of the world, guarded by nymphs and a dragon who never slept. The symbolism was perfect. Beauty, immortality, and a guardian who never stopped watching. Hera's entire existence in one mythological image. She became queen of Olympus the same day Zeus became king. They ascended together. They ruled together. They were, in theory, partners in cosmic governance. The king and queen of heaven, the divine embodiment of order and civilization. And from the very beginning, Zeus was unfaithful. Not once, not occasionally, constantly, compulsively, with a relentlessness that suggests something deeper than simple lust, something broken and desperate in the king of gods that drove him to betray the one person who had legitimized his entire rule. Here's what makes Hera's story so devastating. She couldn't leave. Not because she lacked power, not because she was weak or afraid, but because she was the goddess of marriage. Leaving Zeus would mean admitting that marriage, the institution she embodied and protected, could be broken. It would mean acknowledging that vows could be unmade, that some pain was too much to endure, that there were limits to what love and duty could sustain. And if Hera, the goddess herself, couldn't maintain her marriage, what did that say about every mortal woman who came to her temples seeking strength to stay in relationships that were killing them slowly? Hera was trapped by her own divinity, imprisoned by the very role that gave her power. She could punish Zeus's lovers. She could curse their children. She could make Zeus's life miserable in 1,000 small and large ways, but she couldn't leave. And that single fact shaped everything she became. The stories of Hera's revenge are legendary, passed down through millennia as examples of divine jealousy and feminine rage. Leto, pregnant with Zeus's children Apollo and Artemis, was forbidden from giving birth on solid ground because Hera cursed her. She wandered the world in agony, rejected from every shore, until finally, desperately, she found Delos, a floating island that technically wasn't solid ground, and gave birth there while Hera sent serpents and monsters to torment her. Io, one of Zeus's lovers, was transformed into a cow and tormented by a gadfly that drove her mad, forcing her to wander the earth in constant pain. Callisto was turned into a bear and hunted by her own son. Semele, tricked by Hera into asking Zeus to reveal his true form, was burned to ashes by the sight of his divine glory. Echo, who had helped Zeus's affairs by distracting Hera with endless conversation, was cursed to only repeat the last words spoken to her, unable to speak her own thoughts ever again. The list goes on and on, each story a variation on the same theme. Zeus sins, and the women pay the price. Modern readers often see these stories and conclude that Hera was simply cruel, that she was the villain, that she targeted innocent women out of irrational jealousy while ignoring Zeus's actual guilt. And there's truth to that interpretation. Hera's punishments were often wildly disproportionate, often fell on women who had no choice in their relationships with Zeus, who were victims of his manipulation or outright assault. But there's something else happening in these myths, something the ancient Greeks understood instinctively. Hera couldn't punish Zeus. He was too powerful, too protected by cosmic law and his own authority. Attacking the king of gods directly would mean war, would mean destabilizing the entire order of Olympus, would mean becoming exactly the kind of chaos that she had dedicated her existence to preventing. So she did what countless people in powerless positions have done throughout history. She punished the only targets available to her. She displaced her rage onto those who couldn't fight back, who existed outside the protection of divine law, who were collateral damage in a war between gods that had no rules and no referee. But here's where the story gets really interesting, where Hera stops being just a cautionary tale about jealousy and becomes something far more complex. She was an exceptional queen. While Zeus was off seducing mortals and starting wars and generally behaving like a tyrant with a lightning bolt, Hera was actually running Olympus. She mediated disputes between gods. She established laws and protocols. She protected the institutions of marriage and family, not out of naive idealism, but because she understood that civilization required structure, that chaos was easy and order was hard, that someone had to care about the boring, essential work of making society function. She was the goddess who remembered birthdays, who noticed when other gods were struggling, who kept track of debts and obligations and promises. She was, in the most fundamental sense, the adult in the room. And she got almost no credit for it, because everyone was too busy watching Zeus throw lightning bolts and seduce nymphs to notice the goddess who made sure the world didn't fall apart while he was distracted. The relationship between Hera and Zeus is one of those mythological marriages that operates on so many levels it's almost impossible to untangle. On one level, it's the story of a toxic relationship, of a woman trapped by duty and social expectation with a serial philanderer who faces no consequences for his actions. On another level, it's a power struggle between equals, both of them gods, both of them immortal, locked in an eternal chess game where every move has cosmic consequences. On yet another level, it's about the fundamental tension at the heart of Greek civilization, the conflict between individual desire and social obligation, between personal freedom and collective order, between what we want and what we owe to the people and institutions that depend on us. Zeus represented the former, Hera represented the latter, and their marriage was the battleground where those forces collided over and over again for eternity. There's a story less famous than the tales of Hera's revenge that reveals something crucial about her character. Once, frustrated beyond endurance by Zeus's infidelities and autocratic rule, Hera organized a rebellion. She convinced Poseidon and Apollo to join her, along with several other Olympians who were tired of Zeus's tyranny. They drugged him, bound him with unbreakable chains while he slept, and held a council to decide what to do with the king of gods who had become a tyrant. For a moment, just a moment, Hera was free. She had actually done it. She had overthrown the husband who had made her life a prison, removed the king who demanded absolute obedience while showing none of the responsibility that should come with absolute power. But then, Thetis, a sea nymph who owed Zeus a debt, freed him by summoning Briareus, one of the 100-handed giants. Zeus emerged from his chains furious, thunderous, terrible, and his punishment for Hera was designed with cruel precision. He hung her from the sky with golden chains, with anvils attached to her feet, suspended in agony while all of Olympus watched. She hung there for days or years. Time has no meaning for gods. And when he finally released her, when she finally came down, Zeus made her swear an oath never to rebel against him again. And she kept that oath, not because she was weak, not because she was afraid, but because Hera understood something fundamental about herself. She was the goddess of oaths and vows that can't be broken. If she violated her own word, if she proved that oaths meant nothing when they became inconvenient, then everything she represented would become meaningless. She would stop being Hera, goddess of marriage and legitimacy, and become just another god playing games with no consequences. So she stayed. She endured. She transformed her rage into something colder and more calculated, a a lifetime of small revenges and bitter victories that never quite compensated for the fundamental injustice of her existence. She became exactly what the myths remember her as, the jealous wife, the angry queen, the goddess who punished lovers and cursed children and made life miserable for anyone who reminded her of her own powerlessness. But there's another side to Hera that gets forgotten in the tales of revenge and jealousy. She was the protector of women in childbirth, the goddess who understood that bringing life into the world was dangerous, painful, and sacred. Mortal women prayed to Hera when labor began, asking her to guide them through the valley of death that every birth represented. She answered those prayers. Not all of them, because gods are capricious and human suffering is background noise to immortal beings, but enough. Enough that women kept coming to her temples, kept lighting candles and leaving offerings, kept trusting that the goddess who knew suffering intimately would understand theirs. Hera was also the goddess of legitimate children, the one who distinguished between heirs and bastards, who made sure that families could trace their lineage without question, that children born within marriage had rights and protections that others didn't. In a world without DNA tests or legal documents, that distinction mattered. Hera's domain wasn't romantic, it was structural. She was the goddess who made civilization possible by establishing the rules that turned families into dynasties and dynasties into kingdoms. And here's the deepest irony of Hera's existence. She had no children with Zeus who mattered. She gave birth to Ares, god of war, violent and hated even by his own father. She gave birth to Hebe, goddess of youth, who served wine to the gods until she was replaced by Ganymede, one of Zeus's lovers. She gave birth to Eileithyia, goddess of childbirth, who became an echo of Hera's own role. And in some versions, she gave birth to Hephaestus alone, without Zeus's involvement at all, creating him through sheer will as a response to Zeus's solo creation of Athena. But none of them became rulers. None of them mattered in the way that Zeus's other children mattered. Apollo and Artemis, born to Leto, became essential deities of the Greek pantheon. Athena, born from Zeus's head after he swallowed her mother, became the goddess of wisdom and warfare, the favorite daughter, the one who rivaled her father in importance. Dionysus, born to Semele and sewn into Zeus's thigh after her death, became the god of wine and madness and religious ecstasy. Even Heracles, the mortal son of Zeus and Alcmene, achieved immortality and became more famous than any of Hera's divine children. She was the goddess of legitimate marriage, and her own legitimate children were footnotes in a mythology dominated by Zeus's illegitimate offspring. The psychological weight of that reality is almost unbearable to contemplate. Imagine dedicating your entire existence to an institution, to a principle, to a sacred law, and watching it fail in your own life over and over again. Imagine being the goddess of marriage while your husband's affairs produce heroes and gods who eclipse your own children. Imagine being the queen of heaven while your throne feels increasingly like a prison cell that you've decorated yourself. This is Hera's existence. This is the tragedy that the myths are trying to communicate beneath all the stories of revenge and curses. She didn't hate the women Zeus slept with because she was irrationally jealous. She hated them because they represented everything she couldn't have: freedom, choice, the ability to walk away, the possibility that love could exist outside the suffocating structure of divine marriage. Every mistress was a reminder that Zeus could leave any time he wanted and face no consequences, while Hera was chained to Olympus by her own principles. There's a version of the story where Hera briefly leaves Zeus, goes back to her childhood home, tries to reclaim some sense of independence. Zeus, realizing she's gone, doesn't apologize or reform or do any of the things that might actually address the problem. Instead, he stages an elaborate deception. He creates a statue of a woman, dresses it in a wedding gown, and parades it through the streets announcing his new marriage. Hera, hearing the news, returns in a fury, tears the veil off the statue, and discovers the trick. And then, according to the myth, she laughs. She laughs and returns to Olympus with Zeus, and their marriage continues exactly as before. Some interpreters see this as a moment of reconciliation, proof that underneath all the conflict, Zeus and Hera truly loved each other. But look closer at that story. Look at what it actually reveals. Zeus didn't change. He didn't promise to be faithful or acknowledge his failures or treat Hera with the respect she deserved. He just proved that he could manipulate her emotions, that he understood her well enough to know exactly which buttons to push, that their relationship would continue on his terms because he was willing to put in the minimal effort required to keep her bound to him. And Hera? She returned. She always returned, because what else could the goddess of marriage do? The temples to Hera were different from other divine sanctuaries. While Zeus had his shrines on mountaintops, places of thunder and masculine power, Hera's temples were in the valleys, in the towns, in the spaces where human life actually happened. Women came to her seeking help with marriages that were failing, pregnancies that were dangerous, children who were sick, husbands who were cruel. They came because Hera, unlike the other gods, understood what it meant to be trapped by circumstances, to have your entire life defined by a relationship you couldn't escape, to find meaning in duty when love had long since died. The priests and priestesses of Hera taught a strange kind of wisdom. Survival is sacred. Endurance is its own form of strength. Staying can be harder and more meaningful than leaving. It wasn't the wisdom anyone wanted to hear. It still isn't. But for the women who came to those temples with nowhere else to turn, it was the truth they needed. Hera didn't promise them happiness. She promised them dignity. She promised them that suffering for the sake of something larger than yourself wasn't weakness. It was divine. But the question that haunts Hera's mythology, the question that ancient Greeks asked and that we're still asking today, is this: at what point does duty become complicity? At what point does staying in a bad situation stop being noble sacrifice and start being participation in your own destruction? Hera could have left. She was a goddess. She had power, immortality, dominion over her own aspects of reality. Zeus couldn't actually stop her from walking away, not really. The golden chains were temporary. The oath, extracted under duress, had loopholes. The entire structure of divine marriage was something she herself helped establish and could theoretically unmake. She stayed by choice. Every day, for eternity, she chose the marriage over freedom. And the ancient Greeks couldn't decide if that made her the most noble figure in their pantheon or the most tragic. Maybe she was both. Maybe nobility and tragedy are the same thing when you look at them closely enough. Here's what makes Hera's story relevant today, thousands of years after her last temple fell into ruins. She represents a kind of suffering that's still everywhere, still urgent, still misunderstood. The suffering of people who stay in situations that hurt them because leaving would hurt someone else more. The parents who remain in loveless marriages for their children's sake. The employees who endure toxic workplaces because their families depend on that income. The caregivers who sacrifice their own lives to look after people who can't look after themselves. The people who choose duty over happiness, obligation over desire, the needs of others over their own well-being. Modern culture tells us to prioritize ourselves, to leave situations that don't serve us, to cut ties with anything that causes pain. And sometimes that's the right answer, the healthy answer, the answer that saves lives. But sometimes it isn't. Sometimes staying is the harder choice, the braver choice, the choice that holds communities and families and civilizations together when everything else is falling apart. Hera is the goddess of that choice. She's the patron saint of everyone who's ever stayed when leaving seemed impossible, or stayed when leaving seemed like betrayal, or stayed simply because someone had to hold things together and they were the only one willing to do it. That's Hera. That's the goddess behind the myths. And in the end, the most powerful thing about her isn't the revenge or the curses or the dramatic punishments. It's the simple, devastating fact that she chose this. Every day, for all of time, she chooses it. The goddess of marriage trapped by her own divinity, staying because leaving would mean admitting that the thing she made sacred was a lie. That's not jealousy. That's not weakness. That's something far more complicated, far more human, far more worthy of our attention than any of the stories about turning lovers into cows or hanging from the sky in golden chains. Hera is the goddess who teaches us that sometimes the hardest thing in the world is staying, and sometimes staying is the only thing that matters.